This is Jacqueline Lukeman with the Real News Network. Now, by now, most of you have seen the video that has gone viral of a lone man in a navy sweatshirt standing quite like a statue as he is being assaulted by heavily armed, unidentified, and obviously brutal agents of the state in Portland, Oregon. You've seen the lines of moms, some pregnant, arms linked, standing between the federal agents and the protesters, getting tear gassed for their trouble and growing in number in response. You've seen the Portland dads now join them, leaf blowers in hand, to repel the tear gas canisters thrown at protesters, and all in response to shadowy state agents snatching protesters off the streets and whisking them away in unmarked vans as protests after the public lynching of George Floyd have continued in Portland for more than 50 days, as they have across the country. But there is so little national coverage of all the ongoing protests that people think they've stopped unless they live directly in a city where they're still happening. So overall, the media blackout of these protests makes the ongoing coverage of Portland all the more interesting. Now, one might think that the media is focusing on this area because of what federal agents are doing, practically kidnapping people under nefarious circumstances and hiding them in unknown locations, accusing or charging them with flimsy alleged crimes. But honestly, this kind of thing is actually quite normal and has been going on for decades, if not centuries, in this country. When the bodies of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, the three students who were murdered by the Klan during the Freedom Summer in the late 1960s, were discovered in that infamous earthen dam in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the search for those young men had already revealed the bodies of at least 8 other Black men and boys from the rivers in that area that were dredged. 8 Black men and boys who were snatched up by mobs of white vigilantes, the Klan, their sympathizers and friends and apologists, and the cops who gave them cover or who were Klan members themselves, never to be seen alive again by their families, until their bloated and waterlogged bodies were dragged out of some murky river in the search for more high-profile victims. My own grandma would tell me stories about the night riders tearing through the Black neighborhoods, brandishing torches while riding horses, or in dark cars, tearing through town when she was a little girl. And this is the terrorism that they imposed on Black people who didn't stay in their place. They could and would snatch you or a family member up, take them away, and you may never see them again. Or if you did, what you might find might only be their mutilated remains. And if you think this kind of thing only happened in what you believe is the distant past in this country, I must remind you that The Guardian broke the story about Holman Square in 2015, the secret interrogation and detention facility where the Chicago Police Department held over 7,000 people they had snatched up and detained with little, if any, documentation or even booking records to prove a person was ever there. And that made it impossible for people to be found by their attorney or even their families. It's interesting to note that over half of the arrests that were documented took place under Rahm Emanuel's tenure as mayor of Chicago. But officials didn't have any information on people who were detained but not ultimately charged, though, and there were no records for any activity at that facility before 2004, although it absolutely existed and was in full operation before then. And this was in the same city that agreed to pay a multi-million-dollar reparations package to 57 victims of former Chicago commander John Burge and his reign of terror for the unlawful detention and torture, including beatings, electric shock, suffocation with typewriter covers, and games of Russian roulette of over 100 mostly Black Chicagoans between the 1970s and 1993. When the allegations began to become public in around 93, Burge was fired, but with his $4,000 a month pension intact. While other cities may not have had the kind of high-profile operations like a Holman Square or a monster as prolific as John Burge was in their police departments, I'm confident that if you ask Black and Latino and Native people who are old enough to know the history, that they'll tell you that there have been little Holman Squares and little John Burges all over this country. And people think they understand the law by citing that deploying the U.S. military against U.S. citizens is illegal under the 1878 federal law known as the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally bars the use of the active duty U.S. military, the Army, the Navy, Air Force, and Marines from carrying out domestic law enforcement activities. But this law does not apply to state National Guard units, which are state militias, basically. And the 1807 Insurrection Act is the exception to the Posse Comitatus Act that allows a president to deploy federal troops and militia anywhere in the country to put down what they consider to be an insurrection. The Insurrection Act has been used by several presidents to deploy the National Guard to break strikes in the 1800s and the 1900s, often resulting in atrocities such as the Great Railroad Strike Massacre in 1877, the Ludlow Massacre in 1914, the Bayview Massacre in 1886, and several others. And remember that the National Guard was deployed to the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where over 6,000 targets of the worst racist massacre in the history of this country were held by the National Guard without due process for up to 8 days in the destruction and massacre of Black Wall Street. In more recent history, in May of 1970, Ohio Governor Jim Rhodes ordered the National Guard to the Kent State University campus to quell protests against the Vietnam War, where the National Guard opened fire with live ammunition and murdered 4 students and injured 9 others. Police and the militia assaulted students protesting the Vietnam War across the country during that time. Police wounded a dozen protesters at the State University of New York at Buffalo with shotgun fire. National Guard troops attached bayonets to their rifles before charging demonstrators in both Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Carbondale, Illinois. In Madison, Wisconsin, guardsmen indiscriminately fired tear gas into student housing blocks. Just a few days after the Kent State Massacre, Mississippi State Police opened fire into Alexander Hall on the campus of all-Black Jackson State College. But this wasn't about anti-war protests. Students at Jackson State had protested years of racist harassment from white residents in neighboring Fayette. Cops alleged that a dump truck had been set on fire on campus, and they called that a riot, although no students were in the street at the time of the fire. But Mississippi Highway patrolmen carried state-issued shotguns and double-aught buckshot and personal weapons, and even 2 9mm submachine guns to the campus anyway, and fired on the students who were in the dormitory. 2 students were killed, 12 were injured. And that happened after the earlier racist killing of Ben Brown near the Jackson State campus in 1967, the state patrol's murder of 3 Black students and wounding of 28 others at South Carolina State College at Orangeburg in 1968, the assassination of Black Panthers Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in 1969, and the police's fatal shooting of 6 young Black men, all shot in the back during a moment of civil unrest in Augusta, Georgia, just a few days earlier. The National Guard was also deployed during the racial unrest that was already fueled by decades of racist police violence and social oppression across the country in the late 1960s and 70s, and they abused and killed citizens then too. Incidents that were the straw that pushed poor Black residents over the edge included a Black cab driver being brutally beaten by police in Newark, New Jersey, a 16-year-old unarmed Black kid shot to death by a white cop in San Francisco, the mass arrest of 82 partygoers who were assembled to celebrate the return of GIs from Vietnam in an unlicensed after-hours club that existed because there were nowhere else for Black Detroit residents to socialize. The images and accounts of the cops and the National Guard's brutality towards citizens has been documented in books and dramatized in movies from that period of time. Our own Eddie Conway recounts his own experience seeing National Guard troops on the streets of Newark, New Jersey, with a .50 caliber machine gun pointed at women protesting on a street corner, and that caused him to refuse to go to Vietnam. And it was just 2016 that heavily armed private security forces, local and state police, and who knows who else, violently assaulted water and land protectors at Standing Rock. Few know, however, that the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or the EMAC, that was signed into law by Bill Clinton in 1996 in response to Hurricane Andrew to facilitate interstate cooperation between agencies, was used by Jack Dalrymple, then the governor of North Dakota, to convene the multi-state, multi-agency force that was unleashed against protesters trying to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline from being built on sacred indigenous land. And it needs to be noted that this same law was used by Maryland Governor Larry Hogan a year earlier in 2015 to summon police forces from neighboring jurisdictions in Philadelphia and New Jersey to repel protesters in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray in police custody. So why is America suddenly absolutely shocked and outraged at what is honestly just the natural progression of authoritarian police abuse and the deployment of the military or federal agents against U.S. citizens going on in Portland right now? Let's be honest here. It's because of who it's being done to this time around. The man in the viral video is a Navy veteran who had never been to a protest in his life, but had heard about the abuses by law enforcement against the protesters and said that he went down there to see for himself what was going on. Christopher David went down to the federal courthouse to see women, a lot of them pregnant, he saw, linking arms in protest against police brutality, and he went to ask the armed agents why they were ignoring their oath to uphold the Constitution. The women were there, they said, to demand that federal agents stop targeting and abusing and literally kidnapping Portland kids in these protests. What David and the other mostly white women experienced in Portland, instead of what they were sure was their right to peacefully protest and to have that right protected, they were sure that it was going to be, what they experienced instead was what we Black, Latino, and Native American citizens have experienced in the entirety of our relationship with agents of the state in this country when we stand up for our rights. And that's the indiscriminate, violent, terroristic abuse, violations of our rights, violence against our bodies committed against us by the agents of the state. The women were tear gassed and knocked to the ground, and David, as we saw in the video, was beaten with batons by the camouflaged thugs to the point that his hand was broken in 2 places. I hate to say it, friends, but what you're seeing in Portland has been done to other people in this country who don't look like Christopher David and the moms he saw being assaulted. And as I watch this unfold, I cannot help but think of that famous poem by Martin Niemöller, the German Lutheran minister and public critic of Adolf Hitler, who said, "First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Remember that it was only within the last 2 years that mass protests at ICE detention facilities were being held as people learned about secret immigration raids, ICE agents snatching suspected illegals off the streets, raiding workplaces, schools, churches, dragging people away from their families, their jobs, their communities, only to disappear them in facilities that had been secretly built and were shrouded in political and legal cover. But as much of the recent attention to the secret police tactics of immigration agents has been trained on the Trump administration, the truth is that the Obama administration carried out very similar undercover detention activities that were carried over from the Bush administration. The entire history of law enforcement in this country has led us to this moment. And as much as oppressed people have tried to warn the rest of the country that this was coming, few would listen. Are you listening now? Because our future not only depends on knowing this history, but our survival also depends on what you do from here on out, now that you know it. This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network in the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.